issues affecting Asia's animals and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hello and welcome to the AfA Coalition podcast. My name is Winaya, a coordinator for the Social Media Animal Cruelty Coalition, or for short, SMAC, a working group within the AfA Coalition. Today, I'm excited to host a discussion with two experienced speakers from the Born Free Foundation, a core member organization of the AfA Coalition. We will be exploring the complex issue of keeping wild animals as pets, commonly referred to as exotic pets. And the term exotic pet can be quite broad and open to interpretation. However, it's essential to understand the harm that this practice can cause to animals. And fortunately, our guests, Mark Jones and Chris Lewis, are here to provide valuable insights into the current situation and offer suggestions on how we can make a positive impact on animal welfare. So Mark Jones trained as a vet at Liverpool University and worked for many years in fish health and disease control before spending 5 years traveling extensively and working on rescue and rehabilitation projects for so many species, primates, bears, you name it, in South America and Asia. He has a master's degree in both aquatic and wild animal health and several years' experience in the non-government animal protection sector. In 2014, he joined the UK-based international wildlife charity called Born Free, and is currently the head of policy, managing a team focused on promoting the adoption of progressive legislation and policy concerning wildlife conservation, management, and trade, and the welfare of both free-living and captive wild animals at international, national, and local levels. Chris Lewis is a captivity research and policy manager at the same organization. He holds a degree in biology and animal behavior from Exeter University and has worked for over 10 years within and in opposition to the captive wild animal sector, having previously held roles in zoos and other captive animal settings in the UK and New Zealand. Since 2020, Chris's work in Born Free Foundation involves overseeing the production and publication of research into captive animal keeping, including zoos, exotic pets, and performance animals, to inform legislative review and reform and the improvement of animal welfare standards. So please welcome Mark Jones and Chris Lewis. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
So welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast. I'm very pleased to have you both here and also to have you in my first podcast episode ever. So how are you both? I know it's early in the morning, so thank you so much for giving us your time and energy.
Yeah, it's not too early in the morning here in the UK. It's about 9 o'clock. So, I think we're up and raring to go. And it's a real honour to have this opportunity to speak on this podcast.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm awake and I'm ready.
Okay, that is good to hear. I hope this will be a very fun and intriguing podcast. So, Mark and Chris, I'm sure you have a lot of interesting experiences in regards to our topic of today's discussion. And personally, I'm very interested to know about your thoughts and past actions in that conversation. I've known the name Born Free Foundation since childhood, but since I live overseas, I did not know that much detail about the organization, the action and programs that you guys have. Not until I joined the AfA Coalition that I'm able to grasp more insights about Born Free Foundation's work. Would you care to share a bit about the work and goal of Born Free Foundation?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's Mark Jones here. I can kick off on that if that's okay. I've been with the organisation Born Free for coming up to 10 years now. But the organisation is celebrating its 40th anniversary. It was founded in 1984 by the actors Virginia McKenna and her late husband Bill Travers and their son Will Travers. And it was founded as an organization called ZooCheck, really because of concern for the plight and welfare of wild animals that were housed in zoos. Now, over the years, Born Free has grown enormously, and now covers much wider areas of work. We have programs focused on wildlife conservation, principally but not exclusively in parts of Africa. We have our policy team, which Chris and I are members of today, who focus on international and national legislation and policy concerning wildlife conservation and the welfare of both captive and free-living wild animals. And we have an education team which provides educational materials and encourages broader education for students both in here in the UK and across some of the areas we work in Africa in particular, to increase knowledge of wildlife and why looking after wildlife is so important. But at the core of the organisation has always been the welfare of animals, and our rescue and care team still provide opportunities for animals that are in really poor captive conditions in zoos or circuses, or that are used in tourism or whatever, to be removed from those situations and relocated to sanctuaries or rescue centres where, if it's possible, they can be returned to the wild, but where, if that's not possible, they can be provided with lifetime care. So the welfare of individual animals is very, very much at the core of Born Free's philosophy, even though these days we do a lot of work that takes us beyond individual animal welfare into the realm of wildlife conservation more generally.
Okay, thank you for that. Does Chris has anything to add?
That was a very succinct summary. I think that was we I think in the past it's been assumed by many people that our focus and approach has been very singular, but actually when you actually go into the various pieces of work we do, we really do cover a very broad range of topics and concerns, and our reach is certainly very broad, and perhaps we do punch above our weight in terms of our resources and what we try to work on. So we're very ambitious, but we do have very ambitious goals which we are working towards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. So it's clear to say that based on the work and the organization and also your experiences, today's discussion is actually something you're very concerned about. So without further ado, I would like to take a peek on your knowledge by asking a few questions that I think the listeners would also be interested in. So my first question would be about the reason behind the action. So from years of experience in researching, observing, and working to make changes in the area of exotic pets, why do you think that humans keep exotic pets, and what are the driving forces of their intentional keeping of wild animals that obviously are biologically and legally not categorized as companion animals and not considered as domesticated species?
Yeah, I can jump in first. I guess humans have kept exotic animals for thousands of years, going all the way back to the Egyptians, and perhaps even before then. The key thing to discuss here is that the animals that have been kept in the past have, in some cases, become domesticated, such as cats and dogs. But what we're seeing now is an increasing trend towards people keeping more exotic pets or wild animals as pets. And the drivers behind it are varied. There is a common theme with certain perhaps more dangerous or colourful pets that may be a status symbol. There are also pets which are kept perhaps because of their appearance or their rarity, and it's the claim of keeping something which no one else keeps, or wanting to keep an animal which is more colourful or attractive than what someone else is keeping. And there's also the financial reason as well. So a lot of people who are keeping exotic pets are also breeding those animals, and they are then selling those animals for financial gain. So there are a number of different reasons, but it's certainly a trend which, particularly in Western countries, is increasing, especially now there has been such developments with the internet that the access to these animals has never been easier, and acquiring these animals has never been easier. So it's a trend which we are increasingly concerned about, and we're working as hard as we can to try and encourage government bodies to increase their legislative scrutiny of this area.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying that the trend is actually increasing in Western countries. So would you say that this practice considered to be common in the UK and generally accepted?
Yeah, it's very difficult to define, because particularly in the UK, there is no way of knowing exactly how many wild animals are kept as pets. There is specific pieces of legislation which require specific animals to require a license, such as those which are categorized as dangerous. You need a dangerous wild animals license for those. And there are over 2,700 animals categorized as dangerous kept in Great Britain. But then anything outside of that, you do not require a license. You can acquire some data in terms of species which are listed in the CITES appendices, so you know the number that are being imported. But again, the majority are not CITES listed. So the majority of wild animals or exotic pets being kept privately is largely unknown, and it's based on estimates by pet keeping associations and also surveys, which only the sample is only a subset of the population. So it is impossible to say, which again is a great concern, because you don't actually know what's out there, how many are out there, or the conditions that these animals are actually being kept in.
I think, as I say, Chris has summarised that really well. As Chris says, most species in the UK don't require a licence, and it's pretty much legal to keep almost any species as a pet in the UK, and that goes for a number of other countries as well. And as Chris says, no one really knows exactly how many are kept. I did have a look at the latest estimates from the pet food industry in the UK, which are based on small surveys and sales of pet foods and products. And they suggest that there could be as many as 1.5 million caged birds in the UK, 700,000 tortoises and turtles, 600,000 snakes, and that at least 1 in 5 households are thought to keep fish in indoor aquariums. But these are just estimates. Nobody really knows the true numbers.
Right. Okay, that's very interesting. Because this is something that I couldn't really know, since I don't live there. And it's not really different with what I have been observing here as well in Asia countries. And just as you said before, there's a lot of exotic like species of exotic pets that are not licensed, and it's very hard to really regulate them. So my experience led me to think that the term exotic pets can have different definitions depending on the stakeholders involved. Like maybe for some people, fishes are not included as exotic pets since they do have them for quite some time. And the term is really dependent on where you live as well. So by Born Free's and your own definition, what is exotic pet and what animals can be considered as one? And do you think this is this understanding of exotic pets is adopted globally?
Well, for us, the term exotic pet really refers to wild animals, so those that would not normally be domesticated, that are kept in captivity in a domestic setting for the primary purpose of personal interest, entertainment, or companionship. And when we talk about wild animals as pets. When you're talking about exotic pets, you're really talking about animals that are not normally domesticated and that aren't indigenous to the area in which they're being kept. So, animals that are bred or imported from overseas to be kept in people's homes as pets. But as you say, there is no globally accepted definition of what constitutes an exotic pet, and when an animal that's considered to be exotic, originally considered to be exotic and wild, becomes domesticated. I think we all understand what we mean about when we talk about domesticated animals as pets, such as dogs and cats. But when you start talking about other types of animals, like fish and so forth, the definitions start to become really unclear. But for us, it's fairly clear. It's any animal that hasn't been domesticated over many, many generations to live with people.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the explanation. So next question would be about how these exotic animals come about as pets. What kind of things that these animals experience that lead to them being in someone's house? Do you have any experience that you can share in this matter?
Yeah, so it's varied. So there are a number of different ways that a animal could end up in someone's home as a pet. The majority of pets or wild animals kept as pets in the UK are now considered to be captured bred. However, there are still a number which are imported directly from the wild, and both of which come with different welfare concerns and risks. I think the welfare issues have been well documented in terms of wild capture, how species are held after they've been captured, how they are transported, and the risks of underlying diseases manifesting during extreme periods of stress and other biological strains, and then also how they are then kept when they arrive in their destination country. Then they are then transported to another home, a private collection, where ultimately that would be their home, which is also a new environment. These species have also been taken from the wild, so the conditions they're going to be provided along this whole journey will be completely different to how they were experiencing in the wild. And that's why it's believed that the mortality levels from wild collection to actually making all the way to their host or the final destination is incredibly high. Captive bred animals, obviously they don't have as long of a journey from where they began to where they are likely to end up in most cases, although captive bred animals are also transported long distances in some cases. But there are also concerns with captive bred animals in terms of the environmental conditions they are provided with, the diets they are provided, and also the in some cases the social groupings they are provided as well. Just because a animal is breeding in captivity does not mean their welfare needs are being met. An animal innate response is to try and survive and also to try and breed. So it doesn't mean that because an animal is breeding, it doesn't mean that all their welfare needs are being met, sadly. So there are a number of concerns in both areas, and I would sort of urge that just because an animal is captive bred does not necessarily mean that its welfare is necessarily guaranteed, sadly.
Just to give an example, I mean, I think we have to remember that the exotic pet trade is a highly profitable business for traders, and ultimately the motivation for generating the demand for exotic pets and supplying that demand is profit from either legal traders or traffickers, illegal traders. And just to give you one example, African grey parrots are a species that are bred in very large numbers in countries such as South Africa in order to supply the demand for exotic pets, principally in the West. But they also continue to be taken illegally from the wild across much of their range in West Africa. And the species is being devastated by this illegal collection from the wild. And it's estimated, just to sort of emphasize a point that Chris made about the impacts of the trade on these animals, it's estimated that for grey parrots, as many as 2/3 of them that are illegally caught for the exotic pet trade probably die in transit before they ever reach their final destination. But the trade is still profitable to the traffickers who collect them and trade in them. So it's a really, really brutal trade and has huge impacts for the welfare of individual animals, but also for the conservation of populations when animals are taken in large numbers from the wild to supply the demand.
Okay, yes. So you summarized a few of the impacts, welfare and conservation-wise, of the individual animals and the species involved. But what about the impact on humans and other stakeholders that are involved? For example, the environment. How does this practice of wild animal keeping impact those that I mentioned before?
I can kick this off if that's okay. Exotic pets present a risk of injury and infection to traders, keepers, handlers, and other close contacts, as well as other animals they might come into contact with. Bear in mind that these animals are, by definition, exotic. So they're animals that normally, in typical situations, people wouldn't usually come into contact with, and they may carry diseases, or they may present a risk of harming people and other animals if they become aggressive, perhaps because they're scared, or they're stressed or whatever. And we have to remember that we've all recently, over recent years, been through the COVID epidemic, which has had devastating consequences for humanity and for our people's lives and our economies across the world. But COVID is just the latest of a long list of pandemics, a long and increasing list of pandemics that have affected people over recent decades. And we have to remember that the majority of these emerging infectious diseases, which may go on to become pandemics, are of animal origin or zoonotic origin. And most of those infectious diseases originate from wild animals. So this increasing trade in exotic pets poses a significant risk of spreading diseases, some of which may have devastating pandemic potential.
Yeah. Just to add, I think particularly if we're talking about mammals, there was a investigation into the prevalence of zoonotic diseases in mammals in the wildlife trade, and it was just 1/4 of the mammals in the wildlife trade were found to harbour 75% of known zoonotic viruses, a level much higher than domesticated or non-traded mammals. And it was particularly prevalent in primates, carnivores, and bats. And obviously, bats perhaps are not as commonly kept as a pet, but certainly primates are very popular, sadly, as a pet. And to a certain extent, carnivores are as well. And the prevalence of zoonotic diseases is still poorly understood. So even the number of recorded cases, it's likely to be just the tip of the iceberg, because many people probably do not even realize that they have caught a disease from an animal. It may just surface as a cold or a similar sort of illness. So the number which is actually recorded or identified by doctors or where laboratory testing actually occurs is probably minimal. So it's actually probably far more prevalent than what anyone really realizes, without trying to scare people. But that does seem to be an issue that we despite COVID, we do still very poorly understand the prevalence of zoonotic diseases and how often people are being infected by these diseases.
It's worth adding as well that, as well as the risk to the health and safety of humans and other animals, the escape or deliberate release of exotic pets can also result in the establishment of what's called invasive alien species. In other words, species that don't belong in the environment in which they've entered, but can survive and breed and in some cases thrive in that new environment. And this can have potentially serious consequences for the native wildlife and the native environment in which they've been introduced, and result in significant associated costs to try and mitigate and deal with that situation once it's occurred. Just one very commonly quoted example is the emergence of Burmese python populations in Florida in the United States in the Everglades, which are causing huge problems for native wildlife. And most of these animals have been animals that were in the exotic pet trade and that have been released because people don't want them anymore, or they've escaped or whatever. But they're just one example of the hundreds of non-native and invasive species that are harming native species and ecosystems around the world, thanks to the multi-billion-dollar exotic pet trade.
Yes, I understand that. So what I can take from all of our discussion that any form of wild animal keeping is actually not a good idea for all of the concerns that you have mentioned before. But again, it's still going on. It's a practice that is increasing in trend, and some people might argue that if these exotic pets are taken well by their owners, it should be acceptable. So what do you think as animal protection organizations should do against this way of thinking, and how can we develop a meaningful dialogue with society, be it the people who actually own the exotic pets or just the bystanders, to alter their mindset?
It's very difficult because we're in a situation where, because people have been keeping wild animals as pets prior to any legislation being made, we're starting a dialogue or with almost halfway through the process. I think these sort of conversations would be very different if nobody was keeping wild animals as pets, and then somebody came up with the idea of doing so. I think there would be a lot more backlash against it, because there would be the argument which we still make that these animals belong in the wild. it's not possible to meet the needs of these animals in a captive setting. So the idea of keeping one in such an environment is ridiculous. But because it's already happening, we are having a debate or pushing for change when the practice is already fairly well established in certain countries. And obviously the trends may vary over time in terms of the species that are keeping, but the practice almost has become, in some ways, as you say, accepted, and people believe that an animal can be taken care of well in a captive setting. And certainly the welfare issues that wild animal experiences in captivity is on a spectrum. There are certain animals which suffer more than others. But the argument still stands that the needs that these animals require cannot be provided in a captive setting, even with the developments of various different technological advances in terms of environmental parameters and diet. It is still different from the wild, and it provides no meaningful conservation benefit to the species in the wild. So it's very difficult to break something which is almost a habit. But I think the best way to have this dialogue is with supported scientific evidence to justify why these practices are not in the best interests of the animal concerned.
And just to add to that, we believe that strict criteria should be applied to determine which species should be allowed to be traded and kept as pets and which shouldn't. And those criteria should include the need for the animal's health and welfare to be fully provided for, that the risks to the health and safety of other animals and people are zero or minimal, and that the trade doesn't in any way threaten wild populations of the species concerned because of collection from the wild, and that there's no risk to native wildlife and wild habitats should the exotic animals escape or be released. So those are the kind of criteria that we think should be applied. And based on this, some countries are developing so-called positive lists of species that meet these criteria that can be permitted to be traded and kept as pets. And the idea is that instead of banning certain species, you have a list of species that meet these criteria that can be traded and kept, and all other species are prohibited by default. And several European countries have already put in place or are considering such systems, some of them for certain taxa like mammals or reptiles or whatever. But we're seeing some positive moves in this direction in a number of European countries in particular. Canada also has a positive list system in place. And we're encouraging the authorities in, for example, the UK and in other countries to follow suit and introduce these kinds of rules, which should over time restrict the trading and keeping of exotic pets to those species where, as I say, the harms of the trade are minimized.
Okay, that is very interesting. That's a very progressive thinking, in my opinion. This might be a follow-up question because it is very interesting for me about that. So how can we, I know it's happening in European countries, but do you think that we can implement that in the region of Asia, that strict criteria and positive list? Because I do feel like it's still a long way to go. Our law implementation and enforcement are not as strict as Western countries, but how do you think that we can achieve that?
That's a very good question, because we are seeing an explosion in the trading and keeping of and the trend to desire and keep exotic pets all over the world, and in Asia in particular. There's been big increases in the demand for exotic pets, and through the influence of social media influencers and emerging phenomena like exotic animal cafes, which I believe sort of originally emerged in Japan, featuring animals such as otters, which have become very trendy and are spreading to other parts of Asia. And all these things motivate people's desire to own animals that they see as cute or that they feel will give them some kind of status or whatever. It's always got to be, I think, a combination. Ideally, we would address the demand through education, through information, and as Chris says, through the development of the evidence and science that shows that the keeping of wild species as exotic pets is damaging. And hopefully we can persuade people or dissuade people from desiring to keep these animals. But that's a very, very long-term objective. So I think we also have to combine that with legislation. Legislation is a very good motivator in many ways, because most people, most of the time, will avoid doing things which are illegal and are going to get them into trouble. So legislation is also a very good motivator for behavior change in people, and it can be quicker than trying to motivate people to do the right thing through information and education, although you've always got to try and combine the two. So I think we do have to look at legislation. I think, and this is a generalization because it does vary from country to country, but I think it is, we do have opportunities across Asia to try and persuade policymakers, if they're not persuaded by the animal welfare arguments, but actually there are other very good arguments for regulating and limiting the trade in exotic pets. And we've spoken about the risks to human health through the emergence of infectious diseases. That should be a big motivator for governments. And also the risks to the wider environment through the establishment of these invasive alien species through the release of exotic pets into the wider environment, and the impact that can have, which can have huge economic consequences. So if governments and policymakers aren't persuaded by the animal welfare arguments, then at least we have these other arguments to use, that there are very good reasons to limit the trade in order to protect human health and in order to protect the wider environment, which can have all kinds of other economic consequences for people and ultimately for nations.
Yeah, I think just to add as well, I think there needs to be an appetite from the government to want to make that change, and obviously you need to use those arguments which Mark has really well listed there, because unless the government has a particularly progressive attitude and it's already on their mind, and they're just looking for some justification as to why they should do it, there does need to be a number of factors which you present to the legislators as to why this needs to happen, especially if it's not something which was in their immediate plans or on their minds, because there will always be a counter argument as well. So you have to make sure that your argument is strong, it's backed up by evidence, and it can stand up to the criticism of the counter argument as well.
Yes, I agree. And as someone who lives in Asia, I can definitely see the increased trend of exotic animal cafe. We actually have a new one here in Indonesia. They have fennec foxes, and it's a bit For me, it is a bit confusing and stressful, but again, they are welcomed with warmth here. And we do need more educational materials, not only from NGOs, but also from the government as well. But again, as you said before, there needs to be an appetite, motivation, which I think we are lacking in resources to research on the type of appetite that the government wants. However, since you have been in this sector for quite a while, do you feel like Asian countries now have improved in terms of law enforcement and implementation on the regulation of exotic pet issues and the trades as well?
That's a very good question. I think arguably animal welfare law is perhaps more advanced in some parts of the so-called developed Western world, such as the UK. But yet we see how poorly regulated the trade in and keeping of exotic pets is here. In Asia, there's a great disparity between different countries, both in terms of attitudes towards animal welfare and associated legislation, and in terms of how effectively countries police the trade in endangered species or threatened species and implement associated international agreements such as CITES. CITES, for anyone who's not familiar, is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So it regulates the trade in wildlife, not just the trade in live animals for exotic pets, but also the trade in wildlife and wildlife products for listed species that are threatened with extinction and are affected by that trade. So it's one mechanism. It's not, it can never be the only mechanism for dealing with exotic pets, because it only covers a relatively small proportion of the species in trade. And it only covers international trade, in other words, trade across borders between countries. But it is one of the mechanisms we can try and use to regulate and limit the trade in exotic pets for those species that are affected and are listed by CITES. But the degree to which different countries effectively implement this kind of international agreement, even though they're signed up to it and committed to it, varies enormously. And we see so-called compliance procedures, in other words, punishment, if you like, being meted out to different countries, particularly some Southeast Asian countries like Laos, PDR, for example, for not effectively implementing the international rules around the trade in threatened species. So there's an awful long way to go. There are signs of things changing. For example, we saw laws to reduce the farming of wild animals in China as a result of COVID-19. We're seeing some progressive moves in all kinds of different countries to try and improve things through legislation and policy and outreach and so on. But there's an awful long way to go.
I think Mark makes a very important point about it's one thing having the legislation in place, and it's another thing effectively enforcing that legislation as well. And this is an issue we run into in the UK, in Europe. Just because the legislation is there, it doesn't mean or it's not worth the paper it's written on if it's not being enforced effectively. Because if it's not being enforced, people won't follow it. They know that they can get away with non-compliance. And as with Asia, I think, that there can be parallels drawn to Europe in terms of there are particular countries which have particular pieces of legislation. I from my very, very limited knowledge, so I'm not going to profess to being an expert in Asian legislation, but I believe there are certain countries like Singapore which require permits for particular species to be kept. There are other countries which require no licenses, and you can pretty much keep anything at all. There was news in the past that Malaysia was working to amend its Wildlife Conservation Act to further protect wildlife from becoming pets. So there is varying degrees of legislation. But as with Europe, it's exactly the same. There are certain countries where it's been very progressive. There are other countries that could certainly do better. And there's other countries which you would consider to be trailing very far behind in terms of the welfare protections and legislation covering exotic pets.
No, I think there are a number of things that you need to have in place to effectively regulate this very damaging trade and trend in keeping. We need to generate the political will and the progressive policies that we talked about. As always, this requires funding and capacity and expertise within the enforcement authorities to make sure that laws, when they are created, can be effectively enforced. That really involves changing attitudes and behaviours among decision makers, among enforcement authorities, and among the wider public. And we need to deal with the likes of corruption as well. And I say we, I'm talking about the international community as a whole, because a big part of why existing rules and international agreements aren't always implemented is because of corruption. And that's a huge issue that needs to be addressed.
Yes, I agree. Corruption is, especially in Asia, it's a bit hard to, we don't really accept corruption, but in a way we have grown familiar with it, and now it has become a common ground that it is normal, which is morally not good. But again, it is also something that we have to change from our mindset and culture as well. I think these are all of my questions are already answered. We have covered a lot of points in today's discussion, and it has been very interesting and helpful. So thank you very much. As we have reached the last few minutes of our episode, just want to ask if you have any last message that you would like to share to our listeners.
I think we, as an organization, as I said at the beginning, we run conservation programs. We have our policy work, we have our education work, and we have our animal rescue and care work. And when we're looking at our rescue and care work, the ultimate objective of our organization is to keep wildlife in the wild where it belongs, and effectively to remove the need to rescue and care for animals that end up in the exotic pet trade or in other circumstances that they should never have ended up in the first place. I just want to provide perhaps one example. There are around 6,500 cheetahs remaining in the wild, and as few as 500 of those live in the Horn of Africa. And yet there's this really, really dangerous trade in cheetah cubs through the Horn of Africa, primarily to supply demand for cheetahs as exotic pets in the Middle East, where they're considered to be, great status symbols. And this is threatening this small population of cheetahs that remains in the Horn of Africa and in other parts of Africa where they're being hoovered up to supply this demand. This has profound animal welfare consequences for those animals, many of whom die at very young ages, and is having conservation impacts on this vulnerable species in the wild. And our sanctuary, we run a sanctuary, Born Free in Ethiopia, is home to a number of cheetahs that have been rescued from that trade. That's one high profile, but one example of the damage that the exotic pet trade is causing, not only to the welfare of animals, but also to the potential conservation status of a whole species. And, we run a rescue centre that's having to try and deal with and mop up some of the consequences of that trade. That's what we really want to change. And people find out more about that particular issue and about our broader work on the exotic pet trade at our website, which is www.bornfree.org.uk.
Okay, so that is a great message. And to our listeners, don't forget to visit, again, Born Free Foundation on their website, bornfree.org.uk, their social media, and also to support them in their work. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on exotic pets with Born Free Foundation and myself, Vinaya, SMAC coordinator of the AfA Coalition. Don't forget to listen to more of our episodes, which will be updated periodically with new topics and speakers. Because the more people know and understand about animals, the easier the work we do together to create a more human world. Thank you again. Until next time, and goodbye. To summarize our discussion, I would like to reiterate that the keeping of wild animals have insufferable damages not only to the individual animals but also to the other stakeholders involved. The high mortality rate of the animals, the high possibility of zoonotic diseases that evidently had steered humanity to a great loss back in 2020, and the threat it produces for the population species are only a few of a lot of harmful impacts that we keep on pressuring the animals and humanity with. There is an urgent need to grow more scientific-based resources, stricter regulation, and of course a united voice for the greater good to enable more progressive action that not only benefit the animals but also the humanity.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.